Hello and welcome to Advanced Audio Production Techniques 4th lecture. We will be discussing several things today. First, we will talk about micromixing, the fine-tuning and additional processing that you can do in the final phase of your mix. We will be discussing in detail how to use some of the advanced time-based techniques I will describe to you. How to process your main output with dynamic processing, how to print your stems, why and how, and also what sample rates, bit rates, what versions you should print when you print your final mix. Let's get started. Micromixing. Micromixing comes down to focusing on the individual treatment of each instrument. Now, we have already focused on each instrument with dynamic processing and with setting its level and its placement in the image, but focusing now on the individual treatment is done in a more fine and precise way, where in macro mixing it was done more coarse. If we break down, for instance, the process of mixing into the main components, we will see that there are only 4 components: time, frequency, level, and stereo depth and space. Time-based plugins; frequency, dynamic processing; level, our faders; and stereo depth and space can be a combination of imaging, panning, and what kind of reverbs are being used. So one of the first steps we have to do is still continue to refine the distinctiveness between each sound, the kick and bass, the guitars, the vocals, the strings to each other, so that every instrument is easily identifiable by the listener. The separation is especially hard when it comes to the very high frequencies and the low frequencies. The clarity that makes a professional mix so beautiful, and the separation that you will find in between the bass and the kick drum, is what really makes a mix translate well into all different types of environments. Now, automation fine-tuning is a very big one because most engineers will spend almost a third on their mix time on automating different things. And we will discuss this a little bit later on what the purpose of maybe bringing in and out certain instruments during the mix are. But most importantly, the vocal has to be absolutely perfectly automated through the song so it is even and fits right on top of the track. In addition, we should also consider fine-tuning all the time-based plugin. We've discussed this in macro mixing, that certain reverbs can cover up some of the frequencies that you have previously separated and created distinctiveness by having the same frequencies as those instruments. So we want to try to separate the reverbs a little bit, maybe low shelf it, high shelf it, take out some of the mids maybe very finely, not more than 1 or 2 dB, just to create a little bit of more separation between the reverbs and the instrument tracks. Now, during this entire process, you have to always obviously watch your master fader, and we will also apply master plugins. Now, this is not mastering, but it is a way for us to see how our project would sound once more compression is applied. And during the entire process, macro and micro mixing, you have to reference as much as you can. And we've discussed this before, and we will discuss this some more. You should have received by now your changes from your instructor from the macro mix, and I recommend that you don't do anything else to your mix until you have received those changes. Apply everything that is marked, everything that has a point deduction. All this will be checked over again in your micromix grading. Now remember, when you start making these changes, and especially when you start fine-tuning your EQs and dynamic processing, in the micromix stage, the solo button is your enemy. It is more important to see how things sound together, not how they sound individually. Now, when we talk about efficiency, one important part about mixing also now, especially in this stage, is to take notes. When you listen through, you will hear several things that you might hear about automation, or you might hear, well, the kick needs a little more of this, and small things are going to pop through your mind, especially when you're referencing on different monitors. And instead of you stopping on each individual issue, make sure that you just write it down and listen all the way through. Taking the notes will speed up the process of you going in and then focusing on each individual task that you have written down. Once you've finished applying all those changes, listen through again and take additional notes. It will make you much faster at mixing. Now, we already talked about we have to create even more distinctiveness and separation, and that is done by fine-tuning all your EQs and compressors. Now, I still see a lot of times that we try to make things, because we use the solo button, like guitars and pianos and strings, sound thicker in the low frequencies than really works with a full track of, as this is 48 tracks. So now that we're in the stage of not soloing things anymore, let's EQ things so they get out of each other's way. And that a lot of times means remove low frequencies from tracks that might clutter your track. The guitar sounds great with 150, 200 hertz in it boosted, but in the track it might actually not really come through in that range because it is covered by the low frequencies in the piano, the bass, the kick drums, the low snare frequencies, and even the vocal. So let's find other frequencies to feature and rather lower those frequencies out of the instruments that don't really need them. And that it's the same principle here with cutting holes for other sounds. Best example is always bass and kick. If both bass and kick are being featured around 80 hertz, they will only fight each other. So it takes a little bit pre-thinking of where will I put the bass, where will I put the kick, which one in this particular style, genre, and this song should be more featured. Should it be the kick that's very low and the bass above it, or should it be the bass very low and the kick above it? The decision is yours. It just has to work together. And again, use EQ in context. And what that means is consider every other track in your mix. It is not about EQing an individual instrument, and I can't stress that enough. It is all about how things sound together. Now, with panning, we've already probably established most of our placements of the instruments in this song, but if you feel that you still want to create more width, then one of the tricks that I like to use is to take mono tracks like your nylon guitar 2, like the electric guitar, and get them harder to one side, always considering though that I will need another track in the same frequency range to throw to the opposite side so the track does not get too one-sided and heavy on that side. Monitoring at different levels is a part of our referencing, and not just to save your ears, which you will need for the rest of your life if you're going to be a music producer, but it is also about really hearing things differently in a lower level and on different speakers. Again, saying that, rest your ears often. I like to go about 45 minutes to an hour and take a little break, or turn my speakers so far down that one would think that they're actually off, but I'm still listening. The best thing is though to obviously quit for 15 minutes, completely stop, and let your ears rest. Don't forget, headphones have a different way of showing you the imaging in the song. They also are often like to hear the vocal level in headphones. So referencing in headphones is great. Referencing on your laptop speakers is great, because if you can't hear the kick on the laptop speakers, then it is probably void of enough high frequencies and you probably EQ'd it all too low. So different speakers give you different results. I often hear mixes being very wet, and there is a certain amount of reverb and delay that makes a mix very, very big. And this is what we always aim for, is a big mix. But avoid overusing it. If you, for instance, received a comment that says you're using too much reverb, you have two choices. One, turn down the send to that reverb that was discussed. Or overall, if it says it's all overall too wet, then you probably have to pick the ones that are most obvious and lower those. Or consider maybe compressing those reverbs on their output and see if you can therefore tighten up that reverb and put it in its own little space. Now, our final goal for this mix is obviously not to be at -10, -12 dB, but it is actually to get as close to the -3 dB peak as possible without ever going over. We do not want to go over -3. We need to give the mastering engineer enough headroom to apply any additional processing. So we're really shooting between -3 and -6 dB. That should be our goal. Now, if your mix is too low, simply make a group out of the submix faders and raise them until you are right in between -3 and -6. Or, oppositely, if you want to lower them, you can still group them and lower them together. Don't do it individually. Now, one thing that's always a problem in a mix is that it's impossible to hear all the instruments that are playing at the same time. One simple solution, and this is where the additional automation that I mentioned earlier comes in, is that even if a guitar and a piano, for instance, play through an entire verse together, it does not mean that they have to stay at their balance through this verse continuously. So what if you, for instance, bring in the guitar a little louder in the first verse, the piano very low? By the time you get to the half of the second verse, you bring the piano up more than the guitar, therefore creating a little bit of a shift in the mix and therefore creating excitement. This is just one example. There's so many things that can be done in a mix to create more excitement than what we call today linear production. You have to make specific decisions to feature instruments in different sections if especially you're working with something that is not produced but more of a live environment, like for instance a local band that you're producing where the guitar sounds, bass and drums are the same throughout the song. Now you have a chance to not just layer different instruments on top of each other but create nonlinear excitement through automation. Now I want to show you some typical things that I usually hear in the macro mix, and even after the macro mix I often feel that there hasn't been much improvement on these specific items. One, for instance, if your macro mix output level is too hot, then most of the times the micro mix level will be too, because the adjustment was not done. So make sure you get within the range that we need to be. Now, one thing we have already discussed and you should know is we don't move the effect faders. The way that we achieve different effect levels is by how much we change the send level to the effect. And the same kind of applies to the submixer, that we don't want to really mix on the submixer. Now, saying that, I want to point out that I often at the very end will do some very, very fine tuning, half a dB or so, if I feel, for instance, all the drums should come up a little bit, or all my vocals should come up a little bit. So try to do things first on individual tracks, but at the very, very end, if you think you just need a little more push, that's what the submixers are absolutely perfect for. Now, when you get into bigger sessions with 100 tracks, then the submixers are going to be even more important, because a lot of the mixing will happen on the actual submixers, because it's very hard to handle that many tracks. Mixing too wet, as I discussed earlier, it's something that I hear a lot. It's either too wet or too dry. So when you get those comments, make sure you adjust accordingly. Not enough compression and EQ. It goes both ways. Sometimes I see too much vocal compression but not enough drum compression. And as you saw in the macro mixing video, drums can take much more compression than vocals, guitars, or keyboards can. So it needs to be appropriate. I guess that's really the most important thing. Now, when it comes to automation, that is one of the hardest parts, and probably one that even myself I struggled with for many, many, many years, to get vocals to sit just perfectly. And it takes a lot of practice, but it's something you should be aware of. It's sometimes a very time-consuming effort to get the vocal to be at the perfect level throughout the entire song. That same counts for the background vocals. Now, the electric guitars, I often hear them being very loud. Remember the focus of this song, because it is a rhythmical and harmonic element and really drives the song, is the nylon string guitar right after the vocal in the drums. So if I hear the electric guitars being louder than the nylon, or if I hear the sequence guitar being louder than the nylon, then there's a balance issue. You're missing out on what really drives this song. A great example, and this is something I always try when I mix, is I lower or mute all the tracks that I think are unimportant. And I really want to hear if that one instrument that I believe is the driving force in that song and the vocal could stand on their own. So if I would, for instance, do a acoustic guitar vocal version of this song, I could simply just use nylon guitar 1 and the lead vocal, and if that can stand and still drive and still feel, then that is proof to me that it is a driving and very important element of this mix. Now, often kick punch is a really tricky thing, and it's really hard to get just the right punch without missing out on the real bottom. The more compression you add, the more bottom you'll lose. You'll have to make up for it with EQ. So the balance between how much 3K and how much 150 or 300 or 80 hertz you add is really tricky on a kick. And it takes time. And it's the same with the snare. A snare overcompressed will easily be too loud because you're trying to push it up. So although snare can take a lot of compression, when you start to hear it, you need to back up from it. Therefore, you can actually have a better placement in your mix. I want to introduce you to some other concepts that are not part of the assignment, but simple tricks that can really enhance your mixing in the future. One of my favorite things to do is actually ducking the reverb, and we will be discussing this in the advanced time-based section a little later on. But it's a very powerful trick to be able to actually use a little more reverb in the mix without it getting in the way of certain instruments. One powerful thing that you get when mixing analog from the analog gear itself is a slight distortion and saturation from the transistors and tubes and different equipment that the audio runs through. Now we can achieve some of this in the digital environment by using saturation, exciter, and some kind of light distortion on specific tracks. Now this can be pleasing to the ear because it sounds more natural, like we hear things analog, but used too much, it can easily become very destructive to your mix. Let me show you some quick examples of how to use, for instance, saturation on a track. Now, I'm very well aware that not everybody has a saturation plugin, and your regular Pro Tools comes with some distortion and air enhancer, which can give you a little bit of harmonic distortion. And this is really more of an exciter, but you see harmonic generation on the highs and the lows. You have a little bit of saturation here and harmonic distortion, which can help a little bit if used very wisely. But I want to show you here with my favorite saturation plugin called Saturn by FabFilter, which lets you actually have multi-band saturation, which each band have in different types of saturations available. And not only can you do this with different types of saturations, but you can also do it to either the regular stereo field, or choose if you only apply the saturation to the middle only, or the sides only. So I have here a little example, and what I'm going to just set up here for a second is I'm going to create a little bit of saturation in the midst that I'm going to turn down a little bit, and I'm going to bring that to the middle only, and I'm going to just give that a little bit of tube. Then my high mids, I'm going to add a little bit of clean tape, stretched almost all the way, and then my very highs, and that's about 3K and above, I'm going to send only to the width, fully on a warm tape saturation. Now this is without EQ and compression. This is the change that you get. You can see how it immediately sounds wider and actually more natural. Even if I don't reduce the mid to lows. I like it though. See, very powerful, natural harmonics. It sounds much more like you would hear the instrument actually when you hear it live in the room. It has much more width. Now you do have some other tools like the stereo width that will add additional width, but you can see that it's very dangerous and you have to be very careful in its usage. Now you can hear how saturation using an exciter or harmonic distortion can really enhance the frequencies of something without even using an EQ, and do it in a way that is more natural to our ears because of this light distortion. Distortion is often a bad thing, but if used properly, it creates incredible harmonics and really sounds warm to our ears. One thing I really like to do with vocals is take my vocals and create a natural ambience before I send it actually to the hall or plate or whatever I will be using for that song. So that takes a little bit of a different routing technique than we have seen in the basic time-based routing that I will explain to you in advanced time-based setup. It seems so obvious, but it's often forgotten that you can take any one of your individual effect channels and also send them to another effect. For instance, take your quarter note delay and create a send that is going to your guitar ambience, for instance, to extend the delay sound through the reverb. Very simple. You can also send a reverb into a delay. So there's all kinds of different things. I probably wouldn't do it continuously or linear throughout the song, but automate that in specific areas where I'm trying to create a little bit more depth or space. Now you can probably imagine that your reverbs add another layer of dynamics to your entire mix. So processing them with a compressor and EQing them to fit in a certain spot in your mix is very advantageous, and something that I do either in the reverb, if it allows me to do it inside the plugin, or right after. And it's something that you should make a habit. Pull up a reverb, find the right sound, but then tweak it some more. There's so much you can do in your mix to find just the right depth and space for each individual effect that you're adding. I know you've heard me say this a few times before, but what creates excitement in a mix is the opposite of linear. And the opposite of linear means continuous slight changes. Something that easily could be overdone, but changing the amount of reverb for a section can create more depth and width simply by adding a little more reverb in one section than the other, or take the opposite and dry up one section more than the other. And you will see that your mix is more exciting that way. So remember to automate some of these sends. It often only takes a few dB of changes that can make a big impact on your mix. Now we have discussed parallel compression in regards to our drum submixer. But what about parallel compression for individual tracks? It's actually very, very powerful, especially on your kick, your snare, even on vocals. probably not so much in pop R&B, where it's a little bit more dangerous to use too much compression on a vocal. But in a rock song, to add this parallel compressed vocal into your normal track by blending it in with maybe even some saturation can give you a really nice edge. Rock guitars, other guitars. So parallel compression doesn't just have to be used on submixers. You can really use individual parallel compression. Really depends on how many buses you have. But with the newer Pro Tools systems, you should have plenty of buses to go around. Let me show you some examples of how to use parallel compression on individual tracks. First example I'm going to show you is on our kick final, which is the outside microphone on the kick drum. And instead of using EQ and compression, well, I'm actually going to use the EQ but not the compression. Let's duplicate this track very simply here. Now we have the signal twice, and what we can do now is see, the good thing about working with audio tracks in this case is we don't have to send it out. We just duplicate the track. It's much easier. But we can now listen to this track and apply some, what I would call over compression, right? Make it loud for a second so we can hear it here. Make it really snap. Okay, it's obviously too much, but it gives me an idea of what happens here. I just want to see what happens if I change the release time to fast. Okay, and slow. Too slow? Okay, I want to get right into that spot where I get a lot of attack. So that's kind of getting where I want to be. Let's see how high I can go. Really increase the snap. Now I'm getting into limiter area. Okay, that has some nice snaps. Now, let's see what happens if I slowly add this to the kick that I already have. Without. And it's obviously a big volume difference. But you can also tell that it increased the snap without really changing how compression sometimes shortens the sound, right? So this is a good way to add additional compression. Now if I also turn on my other compressor, which is not as harsh as this one, then you can see how these two sounds together probably will have to be lowered just slightly, but it adds a lot of punch to this. Let's take a look at the snare. Now since the snare has two tracks, a snare top and a snare bottom, and I don't want to have to duplicate both of these tracks, I will actually use a send in this case. So I will create an aux, and it will be mono. That will be our input, that will then be compressed. So all I have to do now is choose a bus. So let's say bus 37, rename it to snare site. Then send from each individual snare to snare side, add unity gain and in pre, because remember, we want, if we change this level, we don't want our compression to change. So this is one of those cases where you would actually keep the fader in pre. Call this snare side and add our compression right on here. I'm just going to copy this one over here. And let's take these compressors off for a second and listen to what's coming through here. But because I'm inside, I don't even have to solo these, right? It should still come through. So I hear my combined snare in here. I can even reblend it and say, okay, but I want a little less of the bottom. I want more of the smack from the top snare. Right, so this is at unity gain, this is a little lower, but it's both in pre. Now I can go and apply a lot of compression. I like where this is going already. So now let's see what happens if we take this, turn it down, and add it to our existing snares. Let's see how this sounds in the mix. If I want more snare, instead of turning up these snares, I can just simply turn up my parallel compressed snare. Just make sure that the balance doesn't feature the compression too much. See it without it? Look at where we are. Remember where we've been. So it adds a lot of punch even to the snare. And then imagine you can do this with vocals and guitars also. Now this next example of other things you can do here is probably one that's most fun. Re-recording your effects, chopping them up, creating stutter edits, reversing them. Not much here to really explain, but to really show you in Pro Tools how this would be done. So let's take a look. Now this is not something that necessarily fits this song, but it's a great way to show you how this could be done in an EDM record, or even in an R&B record, hip-hop record. I've heard these kind of effects, stutter effects, even in rock. So it's a cool advanced production technique that, again, creates more excitement in your mix, right? And it's not something everybody knows how to do. So let's take a quick look at it. Again, this is part of our session. Our lead vocal has a send to the special effect hall right here. So we now need to figure out a way how to record the special effect hall in. So instead of this going out the other bus, we will send this to a whole new bus, right? Now this has to be stereo because we want the effect to be stereo. So we will rename this bus to FX record, create a new audio track, stereo, and set the input of that one to FX record. So now we basically route it. SFX hall record, right? We arm the track, and all we want to capture is this piece. So let's just go ahead and record it in. Okay, so now we have this piece. So now what can we do with this? Well, we could reverse it. For instance, let me show you by duplicating. We could take this and put it in front of it using Audio Suite options, reverse, render. Now this file is reversed, so what we could actually do with this file is move it in front of the vocal where it comes in, so it sounds like it goes into the reverb. Let's take a listen to how that sounds. Let's hear this without the track. So kind of eerie effect, right? Now if we imagine that going then into the actual effect, now what we can do is then take this effect and chop it up. So we'll want to go to a very fine grid. And there's several ways to actually chop it up in Pro Tools. One is to write volume automation, right? You can set this to square, set your grid to 30-second notes, and then simply write in a grid that will chop up the vocal. Now you see how it went down first, so we'll have to fix that. So let's take a listen. Right? Or faster, whatever you can imagine. Let's keep this on for a second and see how this sounds in combination. Not sure if that's appropriate for this song, but you can see that recording the effects, reversing them, starter edit them, which, by the way, starter editing in this case would simply be to use your grid to erase pieces out. There's also something called the starter edit plugin that will do this for you, but it's very simple to do it yourself, the same kind of way. And I would recommend to set your automatic fades on this to very, very short, so it doesn't create. You hear the pops on this, which sometimes can actually work, but in this case I would say be careful with those pops. They can get really loud on your record. And you can go in grid mode and start deleting out these pieces. F to apply. So, if there's no new audio created, you could actually do this in this session, but since you are recording this reverb in and I will not have this file, if you should decide to do this, you would have to send me your entire session file again. Please be aware of this. Another thing you can try is adding EQs to the submix channels and actually making slight filter changes during transitions. So another automation of parameters of EQ or filters can create transitional elements in your track. And again, the more of little things you add to your mix, the more exciting the mix gets. I'm going to show you how this would look in Pro Tools. So in this example, as you can see here, I added an EQ7 to our guitar summing mix and bypassed. You can hear we're in the transition to the bridge. So let's turn this plugin on and we will engage both filters, and later on we will even add a little bit of an EQ sweeping through at the same time. So first thing we gotta do is, if we want to automate these, remember Control Option Command, click on them and enable the automation for the parameters that you want. Automate this one and this one. So all these should now show up in our automation lane. Let's see. Yep, they're all showing up. And all we have to do now is put this in touch and play the area. And I will deal with enabling and disabling the automation of this plugin just a little later. But it's now in auto touch. I'll go back a little further. And I'm going to sweep this first on the high pass filter. So let's take a look at that automation of the high pass filter. And it's a little slow coming back. We're going to edit that one out real quick. It's actually easier just to delete and write it down right at this point. And I often like to just simply delete all the extra points and simply keep a beginning and an end point. That's why I kind of prefer to actually write this type of automation by hand. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to just take a look at it for a second, take a listen. Okay, we'll just make that return a little smoother here. And now I'm going to just close the low pass filter just slightly. Not as much, and then return it. See, it's much easier just to do it in the automation lane. That was too much because I'm actually going too high on the high pass filter, so let's just keep that right in here. Okay, that's much better. Now at the same time we're going to gain up this frequency here immediately and then come back and bring that back and then automate the frequency. And we're going to kind of have to do that by hand. I want to start down here. Okay, so that's kind of it. We just want to return this a little bit here. Kind of getting there, okay. So kind of slow coming back. So we're going to put this in read now so we won't mess up the automation any more than we are. Ah, I see why. Okay, I came back too late. Okay. Now another thing we can simply do is keep it up there and just bypass it, which is the next thing I actually want to do. I want to bypass the actual plugin. Control Option Command bypass, enable this automation. And then you will see in here master bypass, and I can simply turn this plugin on and off when I want to. So it creates a little bit of an effect. I also see that the volume is kind of coming up through that, so that will kind of fix that. How will this sound in the whole song? Well, let's take a listen. So that will take some automation in your volume probably because you hear it really getting louder here. So I will just write a little bit down here and then have it kind of rise up. Simple EQ automation to create transitional elements, right? So to recap all the things you could do in your mixes, and again, please know that you don't have to do any of these, nor is this appropriate for every type of song. This needs to be carefully chosen. But some of these are really cool, like automation of your send levels, I think is very important, and dynamic processing of your effect outputs, I think can almost always be applied. But ducking, saturation, exciters, harmonic distortion, sending effects to each other, dynamic processing, automation of your send levels, individual track parallel compression is a big one. Recording and editing your effects afterwards, and sweep filtering your subgroups or individual sounds can also create great effects. And maybe not as drastic as I showed some of these things in the video, but this is a good way for me to demonstrate and for you to hear it in a better way. Remember that some of these things can be done in a much lighter way and still be very effective. Let's go on and talk about advanced time-based techniques.